I've seen two, War and Peace and War and Imperialism. Welcome to this first session of Winter Communist University. The title is, I've seen two, War and Peace and War and Imperialism. I think we can do either. The first session is Mike Macnair. The title is War is the Continuation of Politics, Policy by Other Means. And as you can see from the first slide, there is also continuation of business. So go ahead, Mike.
Okay. Thank you, Yassamine, and thanks for comrades who are coming. Our title was War is the Continuation of Politics/Policy by Other Means. Why it says politics/policy is because this is a famous quote from Karl von Clausewitz, and what he actually says is Politik, only it's a little bit more complicated than that. And Politik in German can mean politics and can mean policy. So page down, here we are. Clausewitz, this is probably picky of him, supposedly at some time before his death. His book, he died in 1831, and his book on war, von Krieger, was published posthumously. And in point of fact, he left shortly before. This is one of the famous versions of the quote. Der Krieg nichts ist als die fortgesetzte Staatspolitik mit anderen Mitteln. More is nothing but the continuation of state policy by other means. This is from Clausewitz's note, generally dated 10th of July, 1827. I've given at the top, I've taken, there's a Clausewitz Studies website, and they have a preferred translation, which is a 1940s translation. Here's another one, Chapter 1, Section 24. Chapter 1 may be the bit which Clausewitz actually had revised before he died, when nobody's clear about any of this stuff. War is a mere continuation by der Politik, so Politik rather than Staatspolitik here. Nicht bloß eine politische Akt, so a political act here, sondern ein wahres politisches Instrument ist, a real political instrument. And then we go on to eine Fortsetzung des politischen Verkehrs, a continuation of political, the translator said political commerce. It's more common to translate as political intercourse. And then section 26 of the same thing. In one kind of war, politics seems almost to disappear. That's in kind of war which is, or policy seems almost to disappear. That's in total war. In another kind of war, it occupies a very prominent place. But in reality, all of these things well, both kinds of war have policy basis. And so political act, political basis, dann betrachtet man die Politik wie die Intelligenz des personifizierenden Staates. If we regard policy as state policy as the intelligence of the personified state, if we regard policy or politics, I think this has to be policy rather than politics here, is the intelligence of the personified state, because it would be bizarre to regard political life in general as the intelligence of the personified state. So the point being, this is Clausewitz's unfinished drafts. We've got a series of these references, and whether he means policy or politics is not entirely clear. I've picked up, there's an enormous literature on this tag, and I have picked up a number of ones which I thought were actually interesting. Vincent Esposito, American military author of the 1950s. Michael Howard produced with a co-author a translation of Clausewitz and also a very short introduction to Clausewitz. And Hugh Strom in 2022 wrote a critique of Howard, which is also in effect a critique of Esposito, on the basis that the translation of politique as policy in all the places is in this case adapted to the arguments of the American and British General Staff in relation to the proper relations of the army and the civil power in the Cold War period. Panayotis Kondylis, I haven't actually managed, I put it in brackets because I haven't actually managed to get hold of it, and it would be great to get hold of it. It's due for reprint in March 25. Clausewitz, Marx, Engels, Lenin, influence on Marxism. Clausewitz and the sociology of war. We've got a very short discussion of the interrelation of war and politics. French author Adrien Chou, What is War? Again, more of that stuff. George Dimitriou, Clausewitz and the Politics of War, a Contemporary Theory. I'm not quite sure that it's a contemporary theory. This is 2020, but the contemporaneity of Dimitriou's view of politics, Clausewitz and the Politics of War, consists in many wars being irregular and the relative marginality of great power war, which in 2025, the idea of the relative marginality of great power war becomes problematic. Also, in a sense, David Keane, The Economic Functions of Violence in Civil War in 1998, republished as in 2005, probably in a slightly expanded version, though it may be just identical, looks at, and I'll come back to this, the idea that it's actually more useful to think of war as driven by economics and economic interests than to think of it as policy. And this is actually quite a lot of what's being discussed in these pieces is actually policy is a bit too neat and tidy. It looks like the state has got a clear idea of what it wants to do and what it's setting out to do, and that's the war that it gets into. So back from these to some more Clausewitz. Book 2, Chapter 3, we're told war is part of the intercourse, or as I said, some of the other sometimes this is translated as commerce, intercourse of the human race. Belongs not to the province of arts and sciences, but to the province of social life. Gesellschaftlichen, I want to be, we can sometimes translate Gesellschaft as economics as opposed to Gemeinschaft, which is community, but Gesellschaftlichen, it's a conflict of great interest which is settled by bloodshed, and only in that it's settled by bloodshed is it different from others. It would be better, instead of comparing it with any art, to liken it to trade. Handel, probably better translated business, to liken it to business, which is also a conflict of human interests and activities. That's an interesting idea, that business or trade is inherently conflictual. It's clearly correct in the sense that contracting parties have conflicting interests, and for that matter, businesses are in conflict with one with another. And it is still more like state policy, in this case, politique, rather than Staatspolitik. So politique, policy, perhaps, or politics. Die ihrerseits wieder als eine Art Handel, which equally may be seen as a kind of business skill on a large scale. What is this? State policy is business on a large scale. The answer is this is within the framework of the mercantilist understanding of the state relation of the state and the economy, which was taught in German universities all through the 18th century and right down to the middle and to some extent the later 19th century. So that the state has an interest in business, and certainly one can talk of each of the states within the territorial expression. Germany was said to be a geographical expression only before unification. Each of the states has is in competition with each other to attract businesses, which will then produce indirect taxation improvements. And then Book 8, we've actually got in Book 8 a whole section, War is an Instrument of Policy. War is called for through the political intercourse of governments and nations. So politischen Verkehr, this is politique here means interstate, what we would call international relations. In general, it's supposed that such intercourse is broken off by war and totally different state of things ensues and subject to no laws but its own. We maintain, says Clausewitz, on the contrary, war is nothing but a continuation of Fortsetzung des politischen Verkehrs mit einer Einmischung anderer Mittel. So not continuation by other means, but continuation with an admixture of other means. And this is an important one because he's insisting that the politics doesn't stop during war. It's not changed into something quite different, but in its essence continues to exist, whatever may be the form of the means that it uses. This is a matter of practical significance that when a war is going on, you don't cease to engage in, people don't cease to engage in either internal politics or external politics, international relations and diplomacy. So this is the famous quotation, but it's the famous quotation, war is the continuation of politics or of policy by other means. Pretty clearly, Clausewitz is correct to have said that his draft is not fully systematized, and he doesn't mean exactly the same thing in these multiple different places. I'm taking starting point, a slightly different starting point with this, which is back to oops, page up, page up, page up, page down. This book 2, chapter 3, Der Krieg ist ein Akt des menschlichen Verkehrs, where the menschlichen Verkehrs is intercourse and it's related to trade, and it's about economics. It's a part of economics. I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. I want to be careful about this. I don't want to say that all wars are motivated by economics. Apart from anything else, it may be the case that there are economic motivations which profoundly affect entry into wars, even in the sense of the economic motivations of the mercantilist states in fighting each other in the 17th, 18th centuries, which is fairly clearly what Clausewitz is addressing. It is, however, more useful, I think, to think about wars having economic effects, and whether those economic effects may well be more determinative about what the practical significance of wars is than the ideological motivations, which may well be the case that people enter into wars for ideological reasons or for political reasons, in the sense, for example, the United States invaded Iraq. It's fairly clear that the United States, why the United States invaded Iraq was a combination of George W. Bush's his father's unfinished business from 1991, plus a bunch of neocons came up with this bizarre idea that the United States was going to create a bastion of democracy in the Middle East by reconstructing Iraq along the lines of the reconstruction of Germany after 1945. This then, it was equally to do with posing the question of war in the Middle East in a different way to the way in which the Clinton administration and had posed it. So these are ideological reasons for entering into the war. At the same time, there are economic effects of entering into the war. So I go from here to ancient war, medieval feudal war, pre-feudal war, feudal war, capitalist war. And ancient pre-feudal war, a substantial element of it is slave taking. I've referred, I think it's the right reference, to Sanjay Subramaniam on the Portuguese Empire in Asia. And Subramaniam, I think it is Subramaniam rather than somebody else, makes the point that pre-colonial warfare was to a considerable extent about taking prisoners of war as slaves. And the consequence, therefore, was that it was substantially less intensely violent than the war conducted by the colonizers, because the colonizers not interested. When they wanted slaves, they bought slaves from African slave markets and African slave traders. They didn't want South Asian slaves, with the consequence that they killed many more people on the battlefield and was a substantially more violent and more disruptive form of warfare than the pre-existing form of warfare. And we've got similarly these proceedings of a 2022 conference point in the same issue, that there's limits on violence. Some of the history, ancient history, the Mesopotamian states and the Iranian states which succeeded them, the practice of slave taking in the form of war is to take prisoner the whole population of a city or large groups of people and deport them into fairly different distant areas to set up new cities under state control. And so, or alternatively, the 597 BCE, the Babylonian captivity of the Jews by the Babylonian Empire. They're deported into Babylonia as a whole group of the urban elite of the local society. 55 BCE, the Romans suffer a really serious military defeat at Carrhae in what's now, I think, probably Syria, or either Syria or Iraq. And the prisoners of war are deported to Merv in what's now Afghanistan. 256, Common Era, the Romans again suffer a very serious defeat, and the Roman prisoners are taken off to a place called Gunde Shapur, after the name of Shapur, the Sasanian king who was victorious in the affairs. And finally, in 540, he's not the only one, but again, Khosrau, the Sasanian king, sacks Antioch and removes the entire population of Antioch to a new city on the Euphrates called New Better Antioch. Khosrau's New Better Antioch, where Antioch, Khosrau. That's one pattern. The other pattern is the Romans, and the Greeks as well as the Romans, but the Romans we know have more detailed information about. Justinian's institutes, the rule is a much older one. Things we capture from the enemy at once become ours by the law of nations. So by this rule, even free men become our slaves. So they escape from our power and return to their own people. They recover their previous condition. And a little bit more detail on the background of this, a guy called Pomponius, writing in the mid-100s CE, but commenting on a book by a man called Quintus Mucius Scaevola, written around 100 BCE. If we have neither friendship nor hospitium with a particular people, nor a treaty made for the purposes of friendship, they're not precisely enemies, but that which passes from us into their hands becomes their property. A freeman of ours who's captured by them becomes their slaves. And similarly, if anything of theirs passes into our hands. So as far as Roman slave taking is concerned, and I think this is quite important to understanding the Roman state, private enterprise slave raiding across the border to anybody who hasn't got a peace treaty with the Romans will generate slaves. And in fact, we know that the Romans raided Ireland for slaves, and conversely, the Irish raided Roman Britain for slaves. And Karl Harper's book, Slavery in the Late Roman World, why it's late Roman, of course, is because partly because Harper has a polemical argument about the persistence of slavery in the late Roman world, but also because our sources get a whole lot better in the late Roman period. We know much more survives, and because much more survives, we can say there is all this slave trading and slave sales, and prices of slaves tell us things, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so taking slaves, the Sasanian, and before the Sasanian, the Parthian, and before the Parthian, the Babylonian state takes whole groups of prisoners of war or city populations and sets them up as cities. The Romans, in contrast, and it's true of the Greeks as well, take individuals and then sell them off to be privately owned slaves, distributed among the general population. But in effect, the economics there is straightforward. We're acquiring skilled labor, because it's skilled labor you keep as slaves. The unskilled labor is guys hired on for the harvest season and so on. If we move into feudalism, we can see war functioning economically in two ways, one of which is taking land. The main feudal classes are all land hungry. The landed aristocracy are land. They want more land, but equally the younger sons of the landed aristocracy are desperate to get land because they aren't going to get much from them. Either you have primogeniture, as you have in England and a number of other places, so the eldest son gets the lot and the younger ones have to go out and make a fortune, or alternatively you get the land divided and subdivided, and in consequence again the holdings of every individual child are small, and there's an aspiration to get more. The peasantry, exactly the same hunger for land. The church has an equivalent, which is hunger for pilgrims, because pilgrims, it's like the tourist industry. You attract people to come to Canterbury to do a pilgrimage to the shrine of the martyr St. Thomas Becket, the king, the Archbishop killed in the cathedral by the king. And part of what's going on with the Crusades is the getting control of the pilgrimage trade, the tourist trade to Jerusalem, for people who are wanting to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And this process, Robert Bartlett's book, The Making of Europe, points out how there's expansion processes. The English expand into eastern Wales, quite a long way into Wales. You can actually still see on the map of the results in the devolution referendum, with the exception of the Labour constituencies which voted for devolution. Otherwise, the map roughly follows the English colonisation of Wales before the conquest in the 13th century. Similarly, in Scotland, there's a spread of the English into Scotland. In Ireland, there's a spread of the English into Ireland. In Germany, there's what's called the Drang nach Osten, the drive to the east, as a result of which Germany expands eastwards, but also you get German towns all across Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the other sort of feudal warfare, chevauchée, is mounted riding, plundering expeditions, very famously carried out throughout the 100 Years' War in the English in France, but actually starting much earlier. So the anonymous at Bethune, who wrote a history of the Dukes of Normandy and Kings of England in the 1220s, talks about beautiful chevauchée, which John Gillingham, who is where I got this quote from, tells us, A, that this guy was a man, and B, that he was a soldier rather than being a clergyman. Richard Cooper, War, Justice and Public Order, back in the 1980s, makes the point that the state, both in England and France, has a choice between war state, which is taking your barons and knights and so on and dumping them by going on conquest expeditions to loot neighboring countries, or on the other hand, attempting to subject them to legal rules controlling their behavior at home. And so law state is where you attempt to make them pay taxes and to behave at home, and war state is where you give up on the effort and just say, go abroad. You can see this, Cooper doesn't talk about this, but trusts in late post-1350 England were a dodge for getting out from under debts, but also for getting out from under feudal obligations to the crown. And when the crown was pursuing policy of law state to try and extract the revenue, they legislate to try and control trusts being used for this purpose. When, on the other hand, they're pursuing the policy of war state, say, fine, you can set up trusts as long as you go to France and loot France. So looting France is an alternative to this. So this is war as, I've given English and French examples. It's easier for me to do so, but one can see the same thing elsewhere. Capitalist warfare is obscured to us because there's a delusional idea which comes originally from Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace, but then resurfaces as a result of Max Beer characterized the English Liberal Party as being anti-war and anti-imperialist, which was quite deeply misleading in the mid-19th century. This Beer writing in the 1890s, and Karl Kautsky picked up on Max Beer's argument and therefore argued that industrial capitalism was anti-war and anti-imperialist, and therefore we get the idea that war and imperialism is a feature of the decline of capitalism, whichever way we get at it. I've put as framework for how I'm trying myself to think about this. There's an enormous, massive literature about imperialism and a certain amount of literature, particularly about geopolitical economy, which is slightly more directly relevant. However, I'm just using my own long series on imperialism and the state from 2022 as a rough framework for framing this stuff. And I've framed it as thinking of war as enclosure, thinking of war as competition-seeking monopoly, and thinking of war as economic stimulus. War as enclosure, we start with the classic, one of the classic books about enclosure, Robert Allen's Enclosure and the Yeoman, the Agricultural Development of the South Midlands from 1992. What Allen shows is that the enclosure advocates' theorization that enclosure was necessary for efficient agricultural development turns out to have been untrue. A lot of the radical agricultural development, at least in South Midlands, the area that he studied, took place through the operations of yeoman farmers and villagers improving for common action. But the enclosure, Allen argues, arises because the 18th century saw a centralization of agricultural finance in the hands of the landed gentry, so that the gentry are the finance capitalist superstructure of a tenant farmer class, so that we get enclosure in connection with the expropriation of the small farmer in favor of the creation of large capitalist farms. And this process also has the effect of throwing up a proletariat, creating a proletariat. This is Marx, familiar Marx, that enclosure creates the proletariat by driving the workers off the land. This list of books which I've got here is not quite in order. Robert Nichols' Settling the Frontier is about the creation of legal land titles, converting feudal superiors into legal landowners in order to enforce English-style economics. And Brenner Bandar's Colonial Lives of Property, Law, Land and Racial Regimes of Ownership is more, it's about racism story, but it's actually the story which she's telling is again one of the colonial regimes imposing formal land titles in order to expropriate the guys who are actually working the fields. And very similar study has been done of property law in late Ottoman Palestine and the way in which the guys who sold the land to Zionist settlers were questionable whether they actually had ownership of the land, except insofar as there was a conversion of feudal superiority into ownership for the purposes of this sort of activity. William Clare Roberts' Marx's Inferno, The Political Theory of Capital, chapter 6 of that discusses Marx's discussion of that in the last parts of Volume 1 of Capital. And then I've given another example, a much more recent one, Emmanuel Ness's book from a couple of years ago, Migration as Economic Imperialism. And the point here is that in spite of all the talk about controlling immigration, etc., 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 the reality is that the quote advanced capitalist countries, put another way, the imperialist countries, are inflicting death and destruction on quote third world countries, and as a result of doing that, expropriating the the more technically sophisticated, the more skilled and advanced sections of the working classes and the middle classes from these countries, so that there's the process of it's actually, in a sense, a return to the slave taking of the classical antiquity, in the sense that what's involved is the direct appropriation of labor, being dragged or pushed out of the countries which are devastated by war, and as a result pulled into the imperialist countries, where they can be used to make up for skills gaps, etc., etc., etc. That's an interesting and important study. It's not, I think, it doesn't lead to the conclusion that leftists should favor immigration controls, because, of course, the effect of immigration controls, as we've seen, is not, in fact, to reduce migration, but simply to increase the power of capital over migrant labor. So my first one then is war as enclosure. It's war in this case in the Peshawar Valley, war in the colonial regime studied by Bandar, and so on and so forth, is directly imposing enclosure and driving the peasants off the land in order to make them available to settler capitalists as or plantation capitalists as a proletariat. War in the Ness's migration as economic imperialism is indirectly driving people to migrate, and as a result driving people to migrate, making them available as a labor force to imperialist capital. Second off, war as competition between capitalists seeking monopoly. I've given a couple of Wikipedia references to the Venetian-Genoese wars, which ran between 1256 and 1381. Actually, I think 1381 is a doubtful end date because the Genoese subsequently became client state of the Portuguese and Spanish states, and the Portuguese and Spanish states did not leave the Venetians alone in possession of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's also the case the Venetians were fighting the Ottoman Turks. But it's clear enough that what's involved is Venice and Genoa fighting over who is going to have control of segments of trade. Similarly, the Anglo-Dutch wars, very transparently, 1652, 64, 54, 1665, 67, 1672, 74. Okay, 1660s and 1670s, there's an overlay between the ideological, the economic aspect, which is fighting over colonies. The Brits take New York off the Dutch, for example. And the ideological aspect that the English crown is seeking to back the French in restoring feudalism in the Netherlands, which is sort of okay. It's not ever likely, but that's the ostensible aim. 1780 to 84, the Dutch took the wrong side in the American War of Independence, and the Brits closed the Amsterdam financial markets by blockading the town. Consider 1914 as it winds up being the Germans who strike the first blow, or the Austrians who strike the first blow, but the background to it is British aggressive encirclement of Germany. And I've given you a reference to Sean McMeekin's book, The Berlin-Baghdad Express, about German-Ottoman relations. There's also stuff written by Parvus in the period when he was a Turkish nationalist between 1912 and 1915. Well, in effect, a Turkish nationalist. Equally, Evans the Sleepwalkers, it's pretty clear that the British and French government sponsored the terrorist operation run out of, sponsored the government in Serbia, which ran the terrorist operation which assassinated Franz Ferdinand. So it is not an innocent operation. But consider equally the invasion of Iraq, the American invasion of Iraq, the effect of that is serious damage to French and German commercial interests, because the lifting, partial lifting of sanctions had resulted in French and German contracts with the Iraqi regime. Or equally, consider the Euromaidan 2014 and the consequences in terms of sanctions, etc., and the attack of 2022. In essence, we're concerned with, we have an effect that French and German interests, indeed European interests more generally, are savagely affected by cutting out Russian gas supplies, but equally, to the extent that sanctions actually operate, the Americans take over from Russian sales of armaments, aerospace, and nuclear power kit. So that there's a straightforward, and we can see similarly with the American, the most immediate, this ban on TikTok. The idea that this ban on TikTok is primarily animated by national security concerns is farcical. The reality is perfectly clear that this is a protectionist measure in the interests of United States big tech, preserving or creating a monopoly. And so this competition-seeking monopoly, there's a whole load. I've given you these. This is just a few examples. There's a whole load of other examples of the same sort. That it's the drive of capitals in that sense is the role of war can function as competition-seeking monopoly. And finally, war as stimulus. I talked about this in the part 4 of the series on imperialism and the state. And the point is, if we think of the world a closed economy, which is what people generally posit, we think of a closed economy, then it isn't the case that war production produces a stimulus. But thinking of a closed economy is mistaken, because what we actually live in is a world of multiple states. And if the result of war production is that a load of arms production is carried on in the United States and paid for by other capitalist powers, then the stimulus effect of the increase in production in armaments takes effect in the United States and stimulates the United States economy, but the depressive effect of the taxes to pay for that, of the costs and so on and so forth, takes place somewhere else. And in relation to, visibly, again, the effects of the Ukraine war, the United States has been substantially, US economy has been substantially stimulated by the Ukraine war. The European economies have been substantially depressed by the Ukraine war. And I think we need to think about that as affecting a whole load of not just the big wars like Ukraine, but also affecting a lot of the small wars. I referred back earlier. David Keane, The Economic Functions of Violence and Civil Wars. Keane has written more extensively on the economics of wars and disasters as stimulative, as beneficial for particular capitalist groups at the expense of other groups, and has a recent book out with a guy called Anderson called Reconomics, as W-R-E-C-K onomics, attempting to generalize the theory. I think that may be a little bit of an overgeneralization, but nonetheless, it's worthwhile thinking about this, because it's not, the United States does not only draw in migrants, and in particular migrants who are subordinate. It's also the case that by creating instability and insecurity elsewhere in the world, the United States draws money into the US economy to keep the US economy afloat, in spite of the fact that the American state runs an enormous deficit. The same, of course, is true of Britain, that the British state runs the British economy runs at an enormous deficit in visible trade, and indeed a deficit in invisible trade as well. It survives because hot money comes into the UK, and it comes into the UK because the country is seen as being a safer destination to keep your money than the home country, which may be being attacked by the United States. And similarly, our fortiori in terms of money flowing into the United States, the ability of the United States to continue manipulating the price of the dollar, and so on and so on and so forth. So war in this sense functions as a stimulus in not quite the same way as war as enclosure driving people to come and work for the imperialists, but moving money into the imperialists' coffers. So here, what I've done, in a sense, going back, starting at the beginning, war is a part of economics, not just a part of war is a part of politics, but politics is a part of economics, and war is a part of economics as well. That's it.
Thanks very much, Mike. In the second part, Conrad Stan will organize the question and answer session. Can I ask everyone who wants to speak to raise their hand, and we'll promote you to panelist.
Vill du veta hur mycket din bil är värd? Inga problem.